Happy Rotation Day, everybody. The start of the month brings with it a new patch, and we have a good deal of changes to go over between updates to cards previously existing within the Revolution Custom Standard roster, as well as tweaks to incoming cards from Kitsuo Dusk of Time and Errors in the Weft. We have 70 cards to talk about here. Two brand new cards as part of the end of the 2025 World Championship festivities, 13 cards from our previous sets getting changed, as well as 20 cards from Kitsuo and 35 from Errors in the Weft. As always, you can find links to the custom Magic Discord server and the Manifesto card search engine in the description below, as well as links to both parts of the Kitsuo and Weft joint set review. One final note before we begin, not included in this presentation is one card not necessarily receiving a change, but is being banned from a format. If you give me just a moment here. So specifically, Faces of the Faceless, an anti-graveyard card coming in Kitsuo Dusk of Time, is being banned in Revolution Brawl. This isn't going to affect you for most matches, but this is just good to note for if and when a Brawl season comes around. This is banned because cards being unable to leave graveyards means that the state-based action to move a commander from the graveyard to the command zone is unable to occur. So if Revolution Custom Commander ever ends up becoming a thing, I would anticipate that being banned there as well. But in the meantime, when we do have the 1v1 Brawl seasons, Faces of the Faceless will not be eligible for play. Now, let's get into the actual cards being changed themselves. Before we can talk about new card changes, though, let's also talk about the final two new cards joining the field as of May 1st, starting with our 2025 World Champion card. Stasis, the winner of Worlds 2025, is introducing us to Fabricated Anomaly, a 2/3 elemental enchantment creature for 2 and a red. On enter, it creates a puzzle box token, which can be tapped to discard a card for a redraw and sacrificed. Oh my goodness, I'm just now noticing while reading this, it doesn't sacrifice. So, I'm mentioning here in my script that it's good with self-sacrificing effects like Damned. Correction, it is not necessarily good with Damned, though it does create a trinket token for you to sacrifice. That token doesn't sacrifice. It sticks around. You just tap it and discard a card to draw a card. That is actually really astoundingly good. I love that. And that makes this card even better to me. Anyways, it creates that token, which can be tapped to discard a card for a redraw, and whenever a creature you control attacks, you can exile cards from your graveyard equal to its power to give that creature a +1/+1 counter. This seems sweet for a number of aggressive and mid-range strategies. While the token doesn't sacrifice, it is still a trinket token to burn 2 damned synergies. It's good for rapid dig aggro decks, appreciating the mixture of graveyard filling and the attack trigger, leveraging all the cards you're shipping to the bin. And even grind your mid-range strategies looking for a solid 3-drop to help smooth draws and bridge into higher cost cards. It's even nice for reanimation strategies, whether you're pulling out a massive creature or just getting smaller things with cards like Extraction Mission, as you can use the puzzle box to get needed cards into your graveyard from hand and dig for the tools you really need. Overall, Anomaly is a sick aggressive value piece. I cannot wait to mess around with it, and catching my misinterpretation of it in the moment here, I'm just leaving that in. I feel like that's the most authentic way to sell that I think this card is stellar. Offset Daemon is the other new card, courtesy of Fantasy Worlds designer Red Pander's Bear. It's a 3/3 Phoenix enchantment creature for 2 a red and a white with flying, lifelink, haste, and this creature can't block. From there, it has an enter trigger limited to only if you cast it that creates a red and white subroutine named Overflow, which runs to return an Offset Daemon from your graveyard to the battlefield. That mixture of keywords alongside the can't block clause make it clear that this is ultimately just going to function as a lightning helix that tries to hit the opponent in the face every turn, with the complication being that the opponent can remove that clock temporarily by destroying it. However, because the overflow token helps to ensure that destroy-based removal doesn't solve the problem forever, even if you do kind of have to predict when it might die for which program you insert the enter trigger subroutine into, there's just some nice recursive value here. It is something that is just going to be able to reliably keep pressuring the opponent, and as a result, this buys you time to interact with the opponent or continue applying pressure with other creatures, and it becomes an extant problem tacked onto other problems that you're presenting the opponent with. It works very nicely with some other token synergies we're getting, particularly token copying effects like Hyomon and Equanimity, which can copy up the overflow token in a pinch to help improve how reliably you can get back the offset daemon the following turn should it die. And it is also good in multiples, because if you have one in your graveyard, then no matter what happens with the one that you cast, you can almost always guarantee that the upkeep trigger the following turn, or sorry, not the upkeep trigger, but the run trigger on the subroutine is going to see offset daemon in the graveyard to bring one back. I'm admittedly a little more dubious of this one, or at least I was at first. But the more I've sat on it, it just is a really nice, solid, annoying threat that doesn't require any internal synergies to be effective at what it's looking to do. It pads your life total. It pressures the opponent. It makes it so killing you becomes harder while your opponent has to deal with the fact that you're killing them pretty effectively. I will say I'm a little bummed here, though, because Offset Daemon and Fabricated Anomaly are both new enchantment creatures that just happen to be in the wrong colors for Leo, Daemon's Hope. Maybe you could make an argument for 4-color enchantment creatures with every color but black in it, but I don't think Offset Daemon needs that to be good. But I will definitely be trying that strategy at some point. Kicking off card changes, we'll begin with the 5 sets remaining in rotation, and then we'll move on to Kitsuo and then Errors in the Weft. With cards remaining in the rotation, we're starting with Redeveloped Cityscape, which is having the card it exiles being moved around in where that exile effect is happening. Now, you no longer exile a card from your hand as part of the cost to activate it, and instead, you can exile the card after getting the basic to play to find another basic to hand, with the qualifier that you can now only exile land cards to Redevelop Cityscape. This definitely is a nerf to how well it can inform opening hands, as it no longer eases the challenge of mulliganing by representing 2 potential lands, regardless of if you actually have others in the opener besides it. So effectively, as the only land in your opening hand, it's no better than Evolving Wilds. However, it is still decent enough at thinning out your lands, especially in multiple instances, to meaningfully help improve your draws later on in the game. And it's no longer useless in the late game, as you no longer need a disposable card in hand to activate it. While I do think it's going to be hurt in terms of its ubiquity, it's still a solid enough card for smoothing out your mana in basic heavy mana bases. And with its ability to find multiple colors of mana that you might need in higher color requirement decks, it could maybe still see some play there. Though, coupling that with the incoming Errors in the Weft fetches, there is definitely some increasing competition for Cityscape. Next up is Charming Siren, whose Leave the Battlefield trigger is being swapped for a Death trigger. This means you can no longer use Charming Siren as effectively with the Ninjutsu package, meaning it's less likely it's super prevalent in those tempo and mid-range shells. It's still usable as powerful sacrifice fodder, which it always was, but it never really was seeing much use as sacrifice fodder, though we are getting some tools in this rotation to bring back smaller creatures more reliably. I could still see folks doing things with Extraction Mission and Dragon Recollection, but for tempo shells where it was looking the most potent, it's probably not going to pop up too often. Honestly, this also is a stealth buff to Sleeper Strix, which is probably going to take over the slot that Charming Siren represented in Ninja decks. Unspeaking Titan is getting a smaller nerf here, preventing its ward from stacking. This is monumental in terms of how annoying it is to deal with. It's still going to be a headache for the opponent, tapping down your opponent's, the opposing creature, still providing some ward taxing, but it now only ever applies ward 1 no matter how many Unspeaking Titans you have. So while it's still going to tax that targeted removal, it doesn't do so anywhere near as potently. It's proven to still be a strong contender for one of the best cheap creatures in the field, thanks to its enter and attack trigger, so we'll still be seeing more of it with its even with its protection being hindered moving forward. Unyielding Titan's also taking hit, and it's honestly a very reasonable one. Its enter and attack trigger can no longer take away lands. If memory serves, Serrated Fossil received this same change back in the January rotation patch, and Titan slipped under the radar because it had more interesting things going on, like the fact it used to grant Death Touch instead of Menace. Much like Unspeaking Titan before it, I think Unyielding Titan is still super playable in the wake of this change. It's just made ever so slightly weaker. Earthly Penchants has proven to be a powerful draw engine and a core part of keeping the Mono Black Integrate engine from Cyberos alive through the many nerfs it has underwent. It's a very low mana investment for the potential to gradually transform it into a 1-mana Phyrexian Arena, even functionally drawing you your opponent's cards as well thanks to its play alongside Data Weaver. Now, it's a 2-mana Phyrexian Arena, slightly harder to get into play early, slightly slower to get online, but likely to still do some good work since it curves into Data Weaver now and is less combative on your first turn for things like Laystone of Being, as we saw used in Worlds this past month. So if you're looking to play a black-based control deck, I think you're probably still looking to reach for Earthly Penchants and Data Weaver as your card advantage suite of choice. Forget Their Names took this past month's Plane Chase GP by storm, only narrowly missing the trophy with a 200-plus card Relentless Bats deck innovated by All Who Wander to leverage the power of the mill planes while using Forget Their Names to exile over 100 bats from the deck, putting themselves solidly out of harm's way by reaching a triple-digit life total, and then just closing out the game with control tools until the opponent runs out of cards, or until other creatures in play could kill them. Though All Who Wander didn't win with this strategy, being defeated by Dr. Chipmunk in the finals, it definitely inspired some concerns about how reliable the tutor suite for this plan is right now between Cryptology, Ripples of History, and Get Your Wish, so moving forward, Forget Their Names can only hit cards in another player's graveyard, not your own. Seeker of New Horizons has inspired a more pervasive concern, with it proving to be a rough creature to fight early or late into the game through the reliability of its scaling coupled with the strength of its blessing. The blessing is being untouched, so you can still enchant your lands to be 4/4s with reach, vigilance, and haste. However, Seeker itself is suffering a heavy blow to its power, specifically in terms of how it makes that blessing token and how well it can be used outside of mono-green strategies. Its ability now triggers whenever a forest enters rather than a basic land, and instead of looking for 7 or more lands to bless the land that enters, you must remove 4 +1/+1 counters from creatures you control in order to bless that land. I think this significantly hurts the card across the board, particularly in red-green Stompy, where red sources now come at a very distinct cost. I could see it still squeezing into mono-green Stompy, where the front half of the effect is largely untouched in a deck of all forests, but its ceiling is much harder to reach now with the tangible cost to creating a blessing token, as ultimately blessing a land doesn't contribute any stats to the board. It just shifts 4 of those points of power and toughness to the land. So you get a wider board at the cost of reducing the size of the creatures you have in play. We'll see if this winds up getting supplanted in mono green, but in multicolor aggro decks, it's pretty outclassed now, I think. Menelea is also taking a hit, no longer able to use her activated ability to protect herself, nor is she able to remove non-+1/+1 counters. This means she's easier to answer for your opponents, and she can't rip keyword or finality counters off of your creatures to protect them, albeit she'll still be able to reliably contribute a meaningful amount of stats to the board initially and help ensure opposing removal is harder to point at the creatures actually threatening your opponent. Unlike Seeker, I don't think these changes disqualify Menelea from play by any measure, and I could absolutely see her continuing to show up in green-based aggro shells, both mono and multicolor. One final hit to green Stompy here, in Grassroots Campaigners, whose landfall trigger is now solely a landfall trigger rather than counting when it enters as well. This does 2 major things. The more obvious is that it slows your progression of pledging by a considerable margin. Fetch lands can still help to maximize the value here, but Campaigners is now more reliant on having other pledge effects available to maximize how often its trigger actually does something useful. The other big impact here is just that this brings Campaigners more cleanly in line with other landfall cards currently in the field. Prior to this past April patch, we had Sifting Through Soot as another landfall card that triggered when it entered, but as of this past month, Campaigners has been the sole card to have landfall that also worked when it entered. So this change unifies all of the landfall cards currently in the field to solely check when a land enters, which is nice to help improve the ease of approaching the landfall suite for any new players at least. I think Campaigners is going to see a hit in its overall play rate, but I do think pledge cards in general are owed more experimentation, so I could see it getting a bit more play, just not as much as it would have merited prior to this nerf. Ragtag Squad is receiving a small update, primarily to have it only be a single token creation event. This seems most relevant with Equanimity, where the difference can be one extra token copy of a permanent you control. A minor change, but could see relevant impact. Kaineos was one of the big winners of Worlds 2025, skyrocketing in play to prove he deserved serious credit thanks to synergy with the removal suite in the current format, and even winning the whole tournament in the hands of Stasis. He's getting a number of heavy hits to his potential, but could maybe still see a bit of play depending on how things line up. He's losing Vigilance for Ward 1, his triggered ability now only works on attack, and he can no longer grab regular enchantments, only auras and blessings. He is gaining a point of power, and between the strong playable blessing creatures in Abzan and tools like Planned Obsolescence, I could totally see him still getting some play, just not to the level that he had previously. Cryptolab's another card that just can't be put down, proving to be an incredibly strong tool alongside the Root Fossil Graveyard ramp package we got in GQ Chaos Reigns. Moving forward, it's losing its cantrip enter trigger entirely and no longer exiling a card from your hand to use its mana on, and is also entering tapped so its mana is not available immediately. To make up for all these losses, it's gaining a sacrifice ability, allowing you to cast an artifact, instant, or sorcery from your graveyard for no additional mana investment to sacrifice it. Honestly, while this is an even bigger hit to Cryptolab's ability to play cards in your hand, I think this is ultimately a boon for the card, as now the card it generates can be reusing a resource you've already played rather than having to dig for something from your deck. And rather than exiling a card from your hand and forecasting it to your opponent, you have the luxury of waiting to decide what you ultimately want to sacrifice your Cryptolab for. It's a slower card early, but a debatably more powerful card later on. If Root Fossil Ramp continues to thrive, which considering it was a mainstay across every tournament so far this year, Cryptolab is likely to continue having a home in those kinds of graveyard ramp decks. Also worth noting, if you cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard with that sacrifice clause, it doesn't exile when it resolves, so you can keep recasting powerful spells from your graveyard over and over again with enough Cryptolabs. Our last change for pre-existing cards is Ziv Replus Sparked, who now only copies activated and triggered abilities of creature and planeswalker cards integrated onto them. This means you aren't going to be able to copy evergreen keywords to grant Ziv evasion or lifelink, or copy static abilities like Data Weaver's text, allowing you to play the cards it integrates. I would still contend that Ziv is up there as one of the strongest planeswalkers currently in the field, and my favorite planeswalker to pair with Dark Horse Victory by far. They're just slightly weaker now depending on what you're integrating. Next up, we have Kitsuo cards, and rather than mixing up the Kitsuo and Errors cards, we're just going to tackle one set at a time. We're kicking off Dusk of Time with Swift Reproach, which is having its draw condition changed from the controller having fewer cards in hand than you to drawing unless they have more in hand than you. This means that if the opponent has as many cards as you do in hand as Reproach resolves, they are still going to draw a card where they wouldn't previously. So you really do need to be ahead on board and behind on cards in hand for this to be an unconditional removal spell with no downside. Still solid for aggressive white decks, but even more rough than it was previously for slower ones. Illusory Savior's combo potential died before it could truly live. Its sacrifice ability now returns the creature it targets to the battlefield tapped with a finality counter when that creature dies, ensuring that Savior can no longer loop with 3 copies of itself. It's a sad day for Smiling Sludge fans indeed, like myself, if you ignore all of the other things that are looking to be amazing with Smiling Sludge. The Dutiful Wanderer now has fewer overlaps with Illustrious Shang-Fa, as her passive has moved from restricting the opponent from both attacking her and casting spells in a turn, to instead limit the opponent to attacking with a maximum of 4 power at once, though this doesn't stop Exalted and other attack triggers from going through on the other side of the table. As her +1 now puts her out of range of dying to a single attack in the face of 4 power swinging at her, her +1 instead turns her into a 3/3 with Indestructible and Double Strike for the turn, rather than making a token. This makes it more likely that players might just use her -3 immediately to ensure she can't single-handedly be wiped out, or to make sure you get some flicker value before she gets knocked below the point of using flickers, rather. And this ensures she can't single-handedly push your board wider without other tools to do so. Honestly, as hard as I was on her compared to Shangfa during the review, my opinions have definitely softened in her favor, and while these changes arguably make her weaker, I'm inclined to say she still has a lot going for her. And I would contend that they make her weaker, if only in the sense that while that passive ability gets a nice buff, making tokens is a lot better than having your Planeswalker be a 3/3, especially the turn you play her. Auspicious Return has received multiple pretty sizable hits. Firstly, it now only triggers when it was cast if it when it enters. So it's not a worthwhile target for flicker effects like Brief Stop, though I suppose that's not the most healthy of play patterns to be flickering your reanimation spell. Furthermore, this end-step flicker has been moved to an upkeep trigger, meaning your opponent gets a turn to deal with the creature you're likely to try and flicker, and whatever you choose to flicker will almost certainly be unable to attack for the turn, limiting your ability to apply pressure with your flicker target, especially if you're flickering whatever big creature you returned. I could still see Auspicious Return being a powerful value or reanimation tool, but the odds are starting to pile up against it. Notorious Skyblade has incurred some concerns surrounding its combat damage trigger and how that copy clause is very easily circumvented with Calamity Cat to result in multiple cantripping creatures that draw cards turn after turn. Now, Notorious Skyblade's combat damage trigger copies an attacking creature that entered this turn. So, honestly, still good with Calamity Cat, but sneakily almost better than Calamity Cat because now creatures you play on subsequent turns and grant haste to with Calamity Cat can be copied up again and again with Notorious Skyblade and with the Skyblade tokens. You're still putting 5/5 worth of flying stats into play on turn 3 with a Calamity Cat in play. But from there, those flyers can be used to copy up other powerful hasty threats, other ninjas, or even themselves with a Rain Dance in play. Twilight Agent is joining in on the cloning element being added in this patch, now allowing it to become a copy of another creature when it deals combat damage to a player. I was iffy on Agent previously, and while the value here is lower in theory, the reality is that's a far more appealing creature to slip in through the opponent's defenses when you've got other good creatures in play. It's worse for tempo, but better for a mid-range strategy for sure, especially since this can become a copy of an opposing creature in a pinch. Moonlight Adversary is having the life gain component to its discard trigger being taken away, which primarily hits two combos that we talked about in the set review. It's a hit to Emperor Zuhan, whose adventure wants to have some way of gaining life to enable him to see more cards with his cycling cost cheating and it hurts the adversary's combo potential with Life Hacker, as Life Hacker, drawing you a card whenever you gained life, enabled an end-step loop with the old version of Adversary. I think this still could see some play, can still rebuy a bunch of cards that got discarded in a single turn, and could theoretically burst for a lot of damage if you have enough cards to discard to hand size, or enough cycling tools that you're pitching for cheap, but it's far less potent with it being unable to buy time against aggressive decks or perform these combo lines. Cage's Mercenary was a card I skipped in my initial set review, mostly as I feel like I'm used to seeing 3/2s for 3 with draw triggers when your creatures die generally being pretty mediocre and constructed. However, the fact that it always draws when it dies means it at least replaces itself in the face of destroy-based removal, and can punish an environment that leans so heavily on edicts like Omen of Slaughter. As a result of the potential draw power here, both as a fair mid-range card and as an engine for dedicated Aristocrats decks, Cage's Mercenary now loses you 1 life whenever it triggers. I think it still gets to look good in the contexts I outlined, but it looks more awkward in the face of aggro and burn. It could still shine in places I hadn't previously considered, and the draw power could do some serious work with the Aristocrats tools padding your life total, but we'll see if this winds up getting some reps in. Perhaps one of the single biggest hits in this set of patch notes is Garation the Stormlord, whose enter and spellcast triggers are both getting sniped hard. Garation's enter trigger now has a cast clause, which is good for preventing some funky flicker chains, I suppose, but makes him a far worse cheat target for the Born from Fire deck. Additionally, rather than his cast trigger letting you damage each non-dragon creature equal to the discounted spell's full mana value, you deal damage to a single creature equal to the difference between the spell's mana value and the amount of mana you spent to cast it. The end result is a fairer card that I feel is much harder to have a ton of faith in. Logistically, this is still a 7 mana 6/6 flyer that lets you cast another spell for free and removes an opposing creature most times, and could potentially remove multiple creatures over multiple turns. It's a ton of momentum and a ton of power here. But a lot of the best ways to slip it into play have a lot less reason to do so now, and it's just hard to be super excited about this card compared to where it used to be. He's not even worth getting off of a Garations entrance. How tragic is that? Orochi Soulfang is shedding its previous anti-artifact and enchantment activated ability, though its new one costs the same to instead move any number of +1/+1 counters from it to another creature you control at sorcery speed. Honestly, I'm inclined to call this a buff, actually, as it means the Soulfang can keep your stats on the board while opening itself up for more triggers later on. Green's getting other solid cards to check artifacts and enchantments anyways, and already has some great tools to do so, and especially with a hit to Seeker of New Horizons, Orochi's Soulfang could try and fight for the slot of Green's new premier scaling 1-drop. I figured it was already a solid stompy tool, but my god is Uncoiling Realmspawn getting a glow up. It's now a 2/2 with Revered, sharing around Trample and a new spellcast trigger to get a +1/+1 counter whenever you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater. I talked a bit about Portal Guardian's potential in the second half of the set review, and while Realmspawn scales half as fast, the Trample is a nice bonus, and the Revered is an even bigger boon to let Realmspawn help spiral your board out of control and make sure they're all getting in through chump blockers. While yes, Realmspawn used to be able to just scale itself and make the rest of your board terrifying in the process, the reality is that in decks that want Realmspawn, the only cards that were truly going to be maximizing the value of Realmspawn were going to be things like Aspiring Anarchist, which, to be fair, still very good with the Uncoiling Realmspawn, especially as you're getting to put +1/+1 counters on all of your creatures. This does push the green stompy decks that want it towards more mid-rangey strategies with 4-cost and even 5-cost spells on their curve, but oh no, there are still some very good cards in that category. So I think ultimately that is a price you're willing to pay to make Uncoiling Realmspawn be a part of your deck. Again, Trample with Revered is already a huge benefit. Ukina Aethersong Basker was my pick for the most powerful of the white-blue 2-drops we're getting in this rotation, and it seems the curators agreed with that assessment, because the flow ability's draw potential is now going to cost you a little bit more time and effort. It is 2 mana more to activate, but because it's a flow ability, that could just mean 2 more creatures being tapped to still let you pay for 1. I think she's still a solid card. Her flow ability is just going to require more effort to be done, and is ultimately going to be relegated to more late-game scenarios, rather than early-game madness with Plush Collection. If you had Butchery at the top of your list for scariest triple pips enchantments from Kitsuo, the curators may have heard your fears. Butchery is receiving tweaks to both of its abilities, with its draw trigger being capped at once per turn, and its second trigger rearranged to be an intervening if. This means Laystone of Storms and Trine Demogus can't both draw from Butchery each turn, and a cycled Laystone of Storms can't get you a second Butchery draw off of the extra ping from the Laystone in play. However, you can still draw 2 cards in a turn cycle with instant speed burn spells or abilities pointed at your opponent's face, so this can still generate some solid momentum. The intervening if clause on that end step trigger means you can't wait until your end step to sacrifice the 3 permanents, while also cleaning up the stack by preventing it from triggering if it's not fulfilled, where previously it would technically trigger every turn to target something even if you didn't sacrifice enough permanents. Overall, it's less draw power, but it's still pretty spooky. I made the argument in the Revolution General chat in the wake of my full review going up that Amaga Seto was my pick for one of the most powerful cards joining the format in this coming rotation, but that is going to get a slight knock now, because her combat trigger is going to be much slower once we finally get our hands on her. She goes from distributing 2 counters to only placing a single one on another creature you control at the start of your combat. I think she's still super strong, and hey, she's one of her only reliable ways of burning up finality counters with her static ability, which doesn't have a ton of use yet, but I think she's still solid, especially with Uncoiling Realm Spawn helping further justify including 4-drops in your stompy decks. And even in more mid-rangey, less stompy strategies, she's a ton of staying power and does continue to play stats turn by turn if your opponent doesn't deal with her. As if Guration being a bad hit off of Guration's entrance wasn't enough, the spell itself is now uncastable off of a Guration enter trigger because it's going up to 7 mana. What an absolute flavor fail. Realistically, though, this kind of makes sense, right? Entrance is a supremely powerful cheat card for ramp decks, mitigated solely by the fact that you need to have enough density of worthy hits to guarantee having a worthwhile permanent in the top 6. Which is reasonable because you're ramping to something, right? This still remains the case, and the 1 extra mana just means you're more all in on this angle of cheating. If you cheat in a Scourge of Capitalism, it's still going to be a 16/16 that kills an opposing creature and deals excess damage to the opponent's face. It's still going to be very scary. Noble Shrine Guard's also getting a pretty sizable hit here, from the fancy 6/6 with a massive cost reduction clause just begging to see play with Ominous Seas to a tame little 1/1 for 5, shedding vigilance and reach and being entirely reliant on having another creature with a bunch of counters on it. When it enters, it doubles the number of counters on another creature you control, number of +1/+1 counters specifically, then granted itself an exact copy of each kind of counter, each counter in general that creature has. So multiple keyword counters, it gains those. Multiple +1/+1 counters, it gets all of those, plus the ones that were doubled. Even a finality counter or an exalted counter, it gets those as well. So let's talk about a hypothetical here where you have Uncoiling Realm Spawn. In theory, if you're curving out, Realm Spawn would have seen a single mana value for spell before turn 5 for it to become a 3/3. Now, you spend turn 5 casting Noble Shrine Guard, triggering the Realm Spawn to make it a 4/4, then doubling those counters to make it a 6/6, while Shrine Guard copies 4 +1/+1 counters and enters as a 5/5. The end result is that you've made your Realm Spawn a bit scarier to deal with, and Shrine Guard just feels like a glorified Harden Scales as a result. It's definitely worthy of concern with how scary it could have gotten alongside Calamity Cat in the previous version, but now it just kind of feels stunningly small. Could do some cool things, but it feels win more to me. Tsubasa Shigane's +1 is receiving a small tweak, moving from shield counters to granting indestructible until end of turn. This is a pretty negligible change in terms of how it affects creatures that are under threat of interaction, mostly minimizing the long-term protection that Tsubasa could provide, which does hurt it for sure. But I think this might be a stealth buff to my favorite janky build-around in Genome Project. If you ninjutsu in Tsubasa, you can respond to your Genome Project trigger for him by using his +1, meaning that Genome Project will then teach Tsubasa indestructible. While he can still be removed with exile removal or damage, this does make him ever so slightly harder for some decks to deal with, I guess. Realistically, he might just be good for Genome Project anyways, as a means of resetting smaller creatures that came in prior to Genome Project and then redeploying them so they get the counters and both +1/+1 counters and keyword counters. So, could be neat. Shigane Potion Master is just completely no more. The first of a few cards from the incumbent sets that have been entirely replaced. Granted, we've seen this already with things like Uncoiling Realm Spawn getting completely overhauled, but this is a different name and everything. Kinscale Reckoner is replacing Potion Master and being upshifted to Mythic Rare as a 5-mana creature that can search up a basic land to play tapped when it deals combat damage to a player. Sorry, not a basic land, any land to play tapped, and can be ninjutsu'd in for 2, a green, and a blue. The lands it gets are also turned into 4/4 dragons permanently, but they're not dragons with flying, so it's not evasion. It's not. It is a lot of power, but it's not. It's not evasion. And this could still be very good. I neglected to talk about Mist Draped Delver in my set review, which has a similar effect, but just doesn't animate the lands it gets, and is ninjutsu'd in for 1 less mana. And it doesn't expose the new lands to creature removal, but in terms of just pure putting a bunch of stats into play, Kinscale Reckoner does hit a lot of notes. Like, if you ninjutsu this in place of a 1/1, that's that's 4 power in place of 1 power, and then you go search up a 4/4 to play, and you can either swing that 4/4 or it's a mana dork. And if it's a utility land or a land of some other function for fixing your mana, or having a powerful enter trigger or a sacrifice ability, whatever that land you search up ends up being, it could be relevant. And then Kill and Scale Reckoner has done something even better than just putting a 4/4 into play. As part of Reckoner being introduced at Mythic, Precognitive Combatant is being downshifted to Rare. And nothing more to say here, honestly. Last for Kitsuo, we have Revolutionary's Monument, whose enter trigger is now limited to letting you slip a non-land, non-golem permanent card instead of just non-golem permanents. I think this is still a sweet ramp target, and with Garation's entrance jumping up to 7 mana, I think there's even more appeal to Revolutionary's Monument as an alternative cheating card. I'm not sure what Shell wants it specifically, as you do need other exciting ramp targets to cycle your permanents out into, but I have to imagine somebody will figure this card out in short order. Heading into the errors in the WEF changes, let's knock out 10 of these 35 right off the bat. The Soul Space dual land cycle is being changed. Previously, these lands, which always enter tapped, came with their respective basic land types, and you could pay 4 mana, including one of each of their colors, while tapping the land to cash the top card of your library. Moving forward, that activated ability on each simply has you Surveil 1. This makes the cycle far simpler, but I worry it also hinders their playability. I know I was dubious of the cash clause, but it did make these a meaningful side grade to the pledged lands from Calyx of Nylon. After this change, though, put simply, these lands are just worse than the pledged lands currently in my eyes, at least in terms of tapped utility duels. They cost 1 more total mana to activate them, as you can't use their own mana to activate them, and they yield half as much surveil power as just pledging to the Tyrael Bureau off of any enemy-colored pledge land, or a good number of the allied color pledge lands. Like, 9 out of the 10 pledge lands can pledge to Tyrael. While yes, the first pledge land activation does nothing in theory without other synergies, they are far better in terms of mana outlets in the long term than Soul Spaces because of the higher impact of the mana of the thing you're getting for the mana you're spending, to the point where I feel like you almost just have to disregard the surveillability in the Soul Spaces entirely. Playing them primarily just as to whether or not you want a dual land with a basic land type. Now, them being activated instant speed is still nice in comparison to sorcery speed on the pledge component, so I could see maybe the white-blue one cropping up in new versions of the white-blue control shell Zangi's been experimenting with in recent months, as a way to spend excess mana on turns you're holding up interaction, but I'm not holding my breath here, and the others are probably less likely to see play in the near future. That being said, as we move beyond this next season, there are still some lands type matters cards. There's a rare cycle in Kitsuo, and we might get more meaningful tools that care about land types in future rotations. So perhaps outside of this season, these could start seeing more meaningful play, but at the very least, I don't see them doing much in the next 4 months. There is another batch of cards receiving some reworking here in this patch that merits some immediate attention before we get to individual changes. Refresh Daemon, Soul Space Refit, Jump, Imperious Admin, and Checkpoint Daemon were all cards getting some eyes from the community for their ability to reuse enter triggers on enchantments you control. I mentioned this fact for 4 of these cards during the set review, though Checkpoint Daemon did slip my notice at the time. However, these cards are getting a slight knock in terms of their power in that regard. Now, these 5 cards only target creatures or subroutines, removing the enter spam functionality with enchantments. I think most of these could still be playable with the right synergies, but you need to care a lot more about creature enter triggers as opposed to enchantments. Of course, subroutines are unaffected by this, so whether you're just nudging your subroutine to another program to get it earlier, or refiring the enter trigger for panic or recurse, there is still some value to be had. Overall, they're definitely less overtly powerful, but probably still playable in any context where you'd want them for flickering creatures, right? Next, we have another rarity downshift, and this one actually merits some additional discussion because it's now common for Pauper play if and when we go back to Pauper seasons. Mask is going down from uncommon, providing the Cliffwalker bounce value decks a repeatable combat trick and anti-removal tool. The bounce decks are losing Charming Siren from their repertoire, but definitely felt like one of the cooler strategies to emerge out of the inaugural Pauper season in April 2024, courtesy of UserCAF's second place GP run. That being said, while the deck seemed to have a phenomenal matchup against the black aggro shells of that environment, those were fueled by Diabolical Minion, which is now banned in Pauper Eternal, forcing that deck to have to reevaluate how it approaches the strategy. And the deck seemed to have a much harder matchup against Mono Red Burn, which was what ultimately took down UserCAF in the finals. So who knows if the deck will have enough staying power next time we take Pauper for a spin. Also relevant for Pauper is the subroutine taking Mask's place at uncommon, Return. This would have been a cool grindier recursion engine for Pauper, but alas, it was not meant to be. I still think this card is fine, not overwhelming or draw-dropping by any measure, but it's fine. I wish I could get back enchantments too so I could reanimate Secrecy, but I'll live without that, I think. Up next is Earn Your Wings, which is being replaced with Linked Hoversuit, a 1-in-a-white equipment that gives the equipped creature +1/+1 and flying, and can be equipped for 4, though that cost is reduced by the number of enchantments you control. Honestly, this seems decent. Granting evasion for cheap is nice, and we have things like Seal Shoals that absolutely love the idea of free activated abilities. Obviously, there's work you have to do in order for Hoversuit to actually be free to equip, but maybe in a Seal Shoals deck that's worth doing. Priority Inversion's receiving an overhaul, one of 2 members of its cycle to get this treatment. It's jumping up 1 mana and going up to a massive 9/5 stat line, but at each end step, it gains you twice as much life as you lost that turn, winning you the game at your upkeep if you have 50 or more life. This remains an absolute game ender against aggro decks unequipped to remove it, as they're forced to swing enough damage to kill you in one shot, or else risk the damage driving your life total higher. You can also rig this against yourself with tools like Omnipotence or Emperor Zuhan, driving your life total low before using Priority Inversion to go right back up to a comfortable number. It's also a sweet potential tool alongside the Life Gain Matters suite of Awakening in Eldoon, but that's likely to be less important on the whole. Harder to get in play, but Priority Inversion could still be quite a haymaker. The exec cycle is also seeing some tweaks to 3 of its cards. And yes, the fact that we're already on blue does mean that Dorisha slipped into the field unscathed. Convol, however, is not so lucky. Rather than drawing you cards for permanents you control with mana values 1 through 4, he instead untaps another creature you control, making it a 5/5 with hexproof for the turn, and allowing it to draw you 2 cards when that creature deals combat damage to an opponent. Convol is likely moving out of his potential role as a control tool into his new role as a potential mid-range card, helping you push a solid amount of damage and threatening to still generate card advantage in the process. From his enter trigger now having insane ambush potential against opposing decks, attacking, and even serving as protection against targeted removal, Convol could be a sweet include even in tempo shells. Duress is getting a teensy bit of a hit. Kind of. With both incumbent sets having Duress innately, it's not too surprising to see one of the 2 set files lose Duress as they're entering the field. But honestly, we're getting a solid contender to fight Duress for those sideboard slots it's looking to be in. Absentia is a single black sorcery that does the same hand attack setup generally, but it lets you choose any non-land card with mana value 2 or less in the opponent's hand or graveyard to exile. It's better against lower curve decks for sure, but also has some play into combo and graveyard strategies that makes it pretty interesting, depending on the texture of the format. A Tear in the Weft was another card I skipped over, largely as I deemed it to be too awkward. Corrupt is hard to hit when X-cost spells encourage you to spend a lot of mana, and Tear really wants you to have something that costs more than it to make it sing. Exiling X cards from each player's library, letting you cast a single spell with mana value X or less for free. So whatever your biggest permanent is in your deck, you're going to be unable to cast more copies if you corrupt it. The big incentive to do so was that Tear could let you cast any number of spells with X or less mana value if it was corrupted, potentially stealing a bunch of the opponent's cards. Now, that corrupt clause only gives access to a single second spell. It could be a decent mana ramp outlet, but there are honestly just better things to be ramping to right now, especially with this nerf hurting how hard it can really go crazy. Bara was another one of my highly anticipated most powerful incoming cards, so unsurprisingly, the 4/4 for 3 that draws you 2 cards isn't sticking around as is. Now, it casts for 2 and a black, making it more accessible and splashable, but only creates 1/1 black jellyfish tokens instead of 2/2 birds, though they are still enchantment creatures with flying. While black aggro could still look to it, the stat loss is a significant hit to its power there. I like it a lot more in the damned decks like the black-red strategy, whether you're building towards aristocrats or even just general damned aggro, as the tokens being smaller makes sacrificing them less painful. I could still see this one get play, but it won't shine to the level we were expecting by any means. I'll probably still queue it though. Keon is receiving a major overhaul from being a hand-eradicating machine to instead prioritizing value in your hand. She's now got Death Touch in place of Menace, and her Enter and Attack trigger lets you optionally reveal the top 2 cards of your library, gaining life equal to their combined mana value if you do so before putting them into your hand and losing you 7 life. This definitely skews towards wanting to be in a mid-range shell with a reasonably high average mana value, but there's also just value to be had in flipping 2 lands, losing 7, and then using Sonido Voidsinger to gain back some life with either her 0 or her -3. Honestly, as I scripted this, I realized Sonido could just 0 give Keon lifelink and make it so her losing you 7 life doesn't actually hurt because you're gaining 7 life from your 7/7 lifelinker. So yeah, just play Keon in a white-black deck with Sonido. That seems pretty sweet. Entropy Inversion's the other big error getting tweaked, going down 1 mana but gaining 3 toughness. Now, when it enters or leaves, you swap your graveyard and your library before shuffling, and it draws you a card whenever it dies. This can be sweet for self-mill strategies, while kind of funky with Faces of the Faceless shutting off its first trigger. I'm not sure where I land on this, but there's definitely some cool things to do with putting important, necessary cards in your graveyard early through things like the Worlds card, the Anomaly, but I don't know if this is going to start seeing play, even with the 1 fewer mana cost. Cash Thrasher is getting a small but deserved hit, losing first strike outside of your turn. Card's still sweet. I don't have time to do my whole rant about how this card should be played. Just queue it up with Impulsive Underling and have fun. No change to function here. Bypass is just having its reminder text shortened. Moving on. Electronic Countermeasures is a spell I was surprised to generally be happy with, as one of the only complaints I had against it being that unlike Heedless Cruelty, it couldn't hit Planeswalkers. Well, complaint invalidated. Now it can. Countermeasures looks better as a mid-range tool for sure, and if you're doing some grinding mid-range or control things outside of black, it might be a phenomenal include for your interaction suite. Panic is receiving perhaps one of my favorite changes of this entire patch. Its enter trigger no longer scales based on the discarded card's mana value, instead always dealing 4 damage if you discarded a card to it when it enters. This means whether you're pitching a massive cycling creature or a land, it is a reliable known factor. It's better to flicker since the errors in the weft flickers can still hit subroutines, and it works even better with our existing discard package, especially as you're discarding many low-cost cards. I'm definitely going to have to be trying this one sometime soon. Aviviva is our final exec getting changed here, making the mana for the big tokens deck even more awkward. She's losing first strike to instead be uncounterable, and instead of blowing things up to cycle them into new spells, she just creates a 2/2 warrior token that impulse draws a card for the turn when it deals combat damage to the player. This means she's always at least coming in as 7/7 total stats, with a single attack pushing another 2/2 worth of stats into play. And with her being uncounterable, she's almost always going to leave a token behind. Stellar anti-control tool for mid-range decks, and just has me wondering how much you can test the limits of your mana base between Aviviva, Teshima, and Darisha for 4-color enchantments and tokens and legendaries, oh my. We're going to get really stupid with our mana bases these next few months, I promise you that. Immersive Moment's getting a hit to its functionality, with its 2 abilities now being split up as separate modes, so you can protect a creature or cash a card, but not both. This is really just a slight buff to make an escape, which, while it lacks the draw option, is now the better protection spell when you're specifically using it as a protection spell. But, I don't know. Immersive Moment could still see some play. Perhaps the biggest source of shed tears in this patch for me is Piroya's Ordeal, another card that is being completely replaced. Gone is my funny recurring discard fodder, and incoming is Digital Reliquary, a 2 and a green artifact that gives your creatures the tap abilities to add 1 mana of any color, or just surveil 1. The best use case I can think of is that this lets Plush Collection copy any of your creatures, but honestly it seems hard to justify this in Constructed, at least for now. Iterate's receiving a type update, no longer creating or buffing constructs, but instead robots. Although this is sad for Dated Mechanoid and its fellow 1-mana constructs, this is nice for Cliques of Nylon's 0/0 robot tokens, all of which come in with some +1/+1 counters to make the turning of them into 5/5 avatars even better in terms of how much stats they're going to have. Ultimately, though, it's just another point in favor of Iterate being largely a fringe meme. Mystic of Return's first gained ability at level 2 is now updated to only let you play a single land from your graveyard each turn. I don't know if this would have done anything with Warden of Tremors, which is our only current source of additional land drops, but realistically this just means that Mystic is safer to justify leveling up, since it never takes away how many lands it lets you play from your graveyard each turn. Still great with fetches, so probably still great in this field. Last but not least is Ys Trace Talker, whose text box has been completely replaced. Now he triggers on attack to exile a creature card with one or more mana value with exactly one more mana value than his current mana value, from your graveyard, letting Ys become a copy of the exiled card while retaining his attack ability. The best 3-drops in terms of raw power are definitely going to be Zavak and Prideful Reaper, the former making it harder to attack with Ys on subsequent turns, while the latter is probably just going to have Ys die immediately. I hate that I have to continue invoking this accursed deck name, but alas, Ys could be a reason to play blue in balls. Do with that what you will, you sickos. And that concludes the update for Kitsuo, Dusk of Time, Errors in the Weft, and all of the other things changing as our first month of the summer 2025 season begins. I got plenty of decks I'm excited to mock up and start playing, but with all the strong tech options we're getting, it's hard to pin down a strong graveyard of tokens deck without at least being a little wary of opposing counterplay. A lot of interesting texture to go in this field, cool new aggro strategies, cool new slower control and mid-range strategies, so we'll see how things shake out. Once again, you can find links to the Custom Magic Discord server and the Manifesto card search engine in the description below, as well as links to both parts of the Kitsuo and Weft joint set review. I hope you're all excited as I am, and I'll see you all in the Revolution chat. Bye-bye now.